The late afternoon sun hung low over the dusty main street of Millersville, casting long amber shadows that painted the storefronts in fading gold. Sarah had no intention of stopping. She was only passing through, delivering a finished, hemmed coat for a traveling tailor who'd hired her for the week. Her eyes were on the ground, her mind miles away. But something in the corner of her vision caught a glint, a flash of dull brass behind glass, and her feet stopped moving before her mind caught up. There, nestled between a cracked porcelain doll and a rusted pocket knife in the cluttered window display of a rundown pawn shop, was a bracelet. It was old, bent, slightly out of shape, tarnished with time. But she knew it. No, she felt it before she even saw the tiny inscription. Her heart began to race. She pressed her palm to the glass breath, fogging the surface. A name was etched inside the band in scratchy, uneven letters, Sarah, and just beside it a small star with the faint letter L. Her legs almost gave out beneath her. She hadn't seen that bracelet in over 10 years. The last time it was in her possession, she'd been running barefoot through pine needle paths in the night, trying to escape a place where her name was spoken like a command. She'd tripped, she remembered that now. Caught her foot on a tree root, fell hard, and when she got up and kept running, the bracelet must have slipped from her pocket. For years she'd blamed herself for losing the one piece of her mother she had left, and now here it was. The shopkeeper barely looked up when she entered. He was an old man with thick glasses, more interested in his newspaper than the trembling girl standing at his counter with wide eyes and an open mouth. "How much for the bracelet in the window?" she asked, her voice barely holding steady. He pushed his glasses up, peered over the paper, and shrugged. "That old thing, $5. Sarah fumbled with the coins she had sewn into the hem of her apron for safekeeping. She laid out every cent she had, $3.42. "Please," she said, lifting her eyes to meet his. "It's mine. I lost it years ago." The man sighed, rubbed his face, and waved a hand. "Take it. I got it in a box of junk from a foreclosed property in Georgia. Just gathering dust here anyway." She didn't wait for him to change his mind. The moment the metal touched her skin, something in her body shifted. It wasn't just memory, it was weight history blood. Her fingers traced the engraving over and over. Sarah, L, the star. Her mother used to call her Little Light. That star wasn't decorative. It was a message, a sign, a promise. Outside, the wind had picked up, stirring the leaves in the gutters, carrying with it a dry, whispering heat. She stood on the edge of the wooden sidewalk, the bracelet clutched tight in her palm, her heart pounding louder than the horseshoes on cobblestone or the market chatter nearby. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was a door, a knock, a whisper from something bigger than she could explain. She walked. She didn't know where her feet were going at first, but soon she found herself in the back of the town's tiny chapel, where it was quiet and cool. She sat on the last pew, hands clasped tight in her lap. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to remember her mother's face. Not just the hazy outlines or the sound of her lullabies, but the fierce look in her eyes, the way she held her when they hid behind the sugar-cane fields, the smell of her neck after a long day under the sun. Tears came, but she didn't wipe them away. Her body shook and she let it. All this time she tried to bury it, pretended it didn't ache, that it didn't matter. But the bracelet brought it all roaring back, the loss, the longing, and now, the undeniable call to find the truth. She stood. The chapel was still empty. The streets beyond the stained glass were beginning to dim. Sarah knew what she had to do. There would be no more running from the past. The light was calling her back, and this time she would follow. She stepped out of the chapel just as the last streaks of sun dissolved into violet dusk. The bracelet still felt warm in her palm, like it had soaked up all that memory and wasn't ready to let go. Sarah turned it over one more time, her thumb brushing the scratched metal where her name was carved. There was a quiet kind of certainty settling in her chest now, an answer that didn't come with words, only direction. She had to go back, not to where she came from, but to where everything started. The place she had tried so hard to erase from memory, the plantation where she and her mother were last together. It had been over a decade since she was forced from that place, and yet every corner of it still lived inside her. How the wood creaked under bare feet, the way the sugar-cane fields bent like whispering hands in the wind. The way her mother would hold her after dark, singing low to drown out the cries from the other cabins. Her mother called her Little Light, and she'd believed it then. Believed she was someone worth protecting. The journey was quiet and long. Sarah hitched rides from kind strangers, walked stretches barefoot when no wagons passed. She kept the bracelet in her apron pocket close to her stomach like a second heartbeat. The nights were hardest, too much time to think, to wonder if she was chasing ghosts. But even when her legs ached and her hope flickered, she kept moving. Because somewhere in that soil and the planks of those cabins was the last chapter of her mother's story. She needed to read it. It was just past midnight when she arrived. The fields looked smaller now, the trees thinner, as if time had quietly gnawed away at the place while no one was looking. But the bones of it were still there. The long main house up front, the faded shacks in the back, the worn fence that once tried to keep people in or out depending on who you were. She crept around the outer edge, her back pressed to the old timber, until she reached the row of former slave quarters, now mostly used for storage if used at all. And there it was, the last shack at the edge of the trees, the one she and her mother had shared. Sarah crouched in the dark behind it, heart pounding, like she was that small girl again, hiding with her knees pulled to her chest. But this time, she wasn't hiding. She waited. She knew he still lived here. The old man who'd once slept in the shack next to theirs. Ezekiel, they'd called him. Her mother had trusted him, said he had an eye that saw past skin and status. Ezekiel sees with the inside, her mama once whispered. Just after 2 a.m., a lantern flickered to life inside his cabin. A shadow passed the window. She waited until it stilled. Then she rose, walked to the wall, and tapped 3 times, soft but steady. A rhythm from childhood. A signal her mother taught her. 3 knocks. I'm here. I'm safe. There was a long silence, then the door creaked open. The man who stood before her was smaller than she remembered. Bent in the shoulders, his skin the color of clay, his beard now gray and wiry. His eyes were milked over with cataracts, but when he leaned forward, his breath catching something in him recognized her. Lord have mercy, he whispered, almost afraid to speak louder. Is that you, Sarah? Ruth, she nodded too, choked to form words. He stepped aside, motioned her in. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and cedar. The same walls, the same patched-up cot, the same tiny stove glowing in the corner. She sat across from him, and for a moment neither spoke. Then he pointed to the bracelet on her wrist. You kept it all this time, he asked, voice hoarse. I lost it, she replied, but it came back. He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. It was never going to stay gone. That thing's got your mama's spirit in it. She carved it herself. Had me heat the blade so she could etch it proper. Said you'd need it one day. Sarah's eyes stung. I do need it. I need her. Do you know where they took her? Ezekiel's face dropped, shadows tugging at the corners of his mouth. He sat back slowly, exhaling like it pained him to remember. They took her east, he said at last. Macon, Georgia. Said she was dangerous. Said she wouldn't submit. Your mama stood tall in front of that white overseer and told him no. And you know what they did with women who said no. Sarah closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheek. Ezekiel reached across the table, laid his rough hand over hers. She didn't cry when they chained her. But she cried for you. He paused. You go to Georgia, girl. If there's any trace left of her, that's where it'll be. Sarah nodded. Her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. She left the old shack just before dawn, the sky still a pale blue bruise above the trees, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and ashes from Ezekiel's stove. As she walked away, she glanced back once to see the flicker of lantern, light still glowing behind the cracked window pane. Ezekiel sitting alone at the table, his hand still resting on the spot where hers had been. She carried his words with her now, not just the directions to Georgia, but the weight of what they meant. Your mama stood tall, and they couldn't take that from her. The defiance, the fire, the refusal to kneel. Sarah felt it burning in her chest now, like a second heart. The road east was long and not made for women traveling alone, but she never once considered turning back. She bartered chores for meals, traded sewing for bushels of apples and half-filled water jugs. At night, she slept in stables or beneath willow trees, one hand curled around the bracelet, the other pressed against the earth like she might feel her mother's pulse somewhere deep below. Days passed in silence, her feet sore, her voice hoarse from the dust. But inside her, something had shifted. She was no longer just surviving, she was searching. And that difference changed everything. By the time she reached the outskirts of Macon, Georgia, her boots were frayed at the heels, and her skirt had faded 2 shades lighter from the sun. But her eyes were sharper now, her spine straighter. She looked for the old Weatherby plantation, the name Ezekiel had muttered thick with memory and pain. Most of the tracks had been broken up after the war, but pieces of the old estate still remained like bones scattered in the soil. It didn't take long to find someone who remembered. He was a stable boy once, now a man in his 60s with arms like fence posts and a voice like gravel. His name was Thomas, and he leaned against the gate of an old mule barn when Sarah approached. She spoke softly, respectfully, gave him her name, and her mother's, said she was looking for any trace, just one thread of where Ruth might have gone after being brought to Macon. Thomas blinked, furrowed his brow, then let out a slow whistle. "Ruth," he said, drawing the name out like it tasted familiar. "Gotta be 20 years now. Maybe more. Quiet woman. Didn't talk much but sang all the time. Had a cough real bad near the end. Spit blood in her apron, tried to hide it." Sarah's chest tightened. "What happened to her?" she asked. He looked down at his boots, scuffed the dirt. Wasn't strong enough to keep working. They sent her off. Sold her cheap to some farm further south, Kingsley, I think the place was called. They needed someone to tend to a sick woman's baby. She was weak but gentle. Folks said it was her singing kept the child alive. Her throat caught. Did she survive? He shook his head, slow and solemn. Nah. She passed not long after. Word was she never complained. Just faded. Folks said it was consumption. Took her quick. Sarah closed her eyes. Consumption, they called it that, but she knew what it meant. Lung fever, blood on the handkerchief, skin turning to parchment, a sickness that stole breath first, then everything else. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Where? She finally asked, her voice steady, despite the tightness in her chest. Where was she buried? He looked off toward the line of trees just beyond the pasture. Behind a church off of Kingsley Road. Ain't much left there but the bell tower. But there's a stone, small one, has her name. Sarah thanked him with a soft nod, unable to speak past the rising knot in her throat. She walked away with her hands in her pockets, fingering the edges of the bracelet, her steps slow but sure. The idea of her mother lying in some forgotten patch of earth hurt in ways she hadn't expected. She had dreamed foolishly, perhaps, of finding Ruth alive, old, maybe bent with years, but there. But now she knew. Ruth had sung her final song long ago, and yet strangely it didn't hollow her out the way she thought it would. Grief, yes, but also a quiet resolve, because even if her mother was gone, she hadn't disappeared. She had left a trail, a memory strong enough to be passed mouth to mouth, place to place. And now Sarah would follow it to the end. Not just to mourn, but to remember, to reclaim, to say, finally I found you. The last mile to Kingsley would be walked with her head high. The road to Kingsley stretched beneath her feet like a ribbon of dust and memory, winding past fields long since abandoned, fences, half collapsed and swallowed by wild vines. The summer heat bore down heavy, but Sarah kept walking, one foot after the other, her thoughts quieter, now solemn but clear. She no longer imagined what she might find. There would be no reunion, no trembling embrace, no tears falling into the crook of her mother's neck. Ruth was gone. The certainty of it pulsed through her like grief settling into bone. But the knowing strangely brought her peace. It had always been the not knowing that hurt the most. She followed Thomas's directions, carefully counting the crossroads, the turn past the sycamore tree with its twisted trunk, the hollow where the river once ran before the drought came. And then just beyond a low hill, she saw the remnants of a church sagging in its frame. The roof caved in on one side, the bell tower still standing, but leaning like an old man, about to fall to his knees. Grass grew tall around it, uncut and golden, humming with insects. A rusted gate marked the cemetery behind, and Sarah pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning like they remembered every name buried there. The stones were simple, worn by rain and time, many of them unmarked or illegible. But she searched anyway, her fingers brushing the top of each headstone, like reading braille. The morning sun climbed higher as she walked the rows, sweat trailing down her spine. But she didn't stop. She wouldn't not until there. Near the base of a massive oak tree, half shadowed by its reaching limbs, was a stone smaller than most. The edges were rough, like it had been carved in haste, but the letters were still visible. Ruth, 1830, 1869. No last name, no epitaph, just Ruth. Just the years. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the name that had haunted her for years, whispered to her in dreams and half-remembered lullabies. Her legs gave beneath her before she knew it, and she sank to her knees in the overgrown grass, one hand reaching out to trace each letter with trembling fingers. Mama, she whispered the word, breaking open something deep inside her chest. For a long time she didn't speak. She sat there in silence, letting the wind pass over her, carrying the scent of wildflowers and pine, and something older earth and ash and memory. She imagined her mother here laid to rest without ceremony, without family, her body tired from too many years of bending, lifting, surviving. But even now, Ruth's presence felt strong. The woman who had stood tall against injustice, who had carved her daughter's name into a brass bracelet like a prayer, hadn't vanished. She had planted something that outlived her. Sarah reached into her satchel and pulled out the bracelet. The metal had warmed with her body heat as if it too had waited for this moment. She placed it gently at the base of the stone, letting it rest there a while like an offering. But then she picked it back up and fastened it again around her wrist. Not because she couldn't part with it, but because she knew now it wasn't meant to stay with the dead. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to the cool stone eyes closed. "I found you," she said softly. "I found where you rest, Mama, and I'll carry you with me from here." There was no one around to hear her speak, but the oak leaves rustled overhead as if in answer, a hush that wrapped around her like arms. She sat a while longer, just breathing, letting the stillness settle into her bones. There was sadness, yes, and ache that would never fully go away, but also a fullness she hadn't felt in years. The search was over. The wound hadn't vanished, but it had closed. What remained now was a scar, and scars could be lived with. By the time she stood, the sun had moved high overhead, casting the cemetery in bright, unflinching light. Sarah took one last look at the grave before turning toward the road, her heart quieter but stronger. She did not rush. She did not look back. The bracelet clinked softly at her wrist as she walked, not heavy like a chain, but light like a promise fulfilled. She didn't yet know what waited for her back in Millersville, or what kind of life she would shape from the pieces of the past. But she knew this: she would return, not as the girl who had left, but as a woman who had reclaimed something sacred. And somehow that was enough. The walk back to the station felt different. Lighter somehow, not because her body ached any less, or the sun beat down with less insistence, but because something inside her had shifted, as if a tightly wound knot had finally loosened. Sarah boarded the worn-out train heading west just after midday, the bracelet still cool against her wrists, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Outside the window, the land stretched out in waves of gold and rust, the kind of quiet expanse that could make a person feel very small. But for once, she didn't. She didn't feel lost or invisible. She felt held by memory, by legacy, by something larger than sorrow. The return to Millersville was uneventful, but not without weight. She stepped off the train just as dusk returned to the town, her boots touching the same boards where she'd first glimpsed the bracelet in the shop window. Funny, she thought, how a place could look exactly the same and yet never feel the same again. The pawn shop was still there, though its window now displayed nothing of interest. The chapel where she'd first sat with her thoughts still stood quietly on the hill, and her small rented room above the tailor's shop, still dark, still plain, welcomed her like a familiar silence. She unpacked slowly, not out of weariness, but care. Everything she owned fit into one bag, but she laid each item down like it mattered. And when she reached the bracelet, she didn't tuck it away as she might have before. Instead, she placed it gently on the narrow shelf above her bed, beneath a sprig of dried lavender, and next to a folded scrap of linen. A kind of altar. Not to worship what had been lost, but to honor what had been found. In the days that followed, Sarah returned to her routine, but something about her had changed and people noticed. The tailor she worked for, a terse man with a fondness for neat stitches and quiet workers, paused longer than usual when she greeted him. "You all right, girl?" he asked one morning, not unkindly. "I am," she said, offering a smile that came easier now. "I really am." She began teaching again, though she never called it that. Children from nearby families, mostly daughters of field hands and washerwomen, drifted toward her in the afternoons. They would gather behind the chapel or near the back of the tailor's shop, where the brick held warmth from the sun. There in chalk and scrap paper, Sarah taught letters and sounds and the power of names. Not just how to write them, but how to own them. She told the girls every name carries a story. Learn to write yours and no one can take it from you. Sometimes she would glance up and catch sight of one of the girls holding a piece of wire or a string of buttons around their wrist, mimicking the bracelet she wore. And when they asked her about it, she would tell them, "It belonged to someone who loved me enough to leave a map behind." Evenings were quiet. She would sit by her window with a cup of tea watching the sun dip low and the lamplighter make his rounds. Some nights she wept not from grief but from the strange, tender ache of closure, the way a heart stretches to hold both pain and peace at once. On other nights she would write not letters but notes to herself, things she didn't want to forget. Sentences like, "I am the daughter of a woman who stood tall. I carry her light. I carry my own." She didn't speak often of her journey, not because it didn't matter, but because it belonged to her now, like breath or blood, constant quiet and woven into everything she did. People saw the difference, though, in the way she walked, in the way she listened. And though she had not found her mother's arms waiting at the end of the road, she had found something else just as vital. She had found that grief could be sacred, that remembrance could be strength, and that home was not always a place, but sometimes a purpose. And so Sarah remained not to escape what had been, but to build something with it. Something steady, something luminous, something that whispered in every lesson, every stitch, every lullaby hummed under her breath. The light is still here. As summer ripened into the burnished golds of early autumn, Sarah's days settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. There was work, of course, long hours hunched over fabric in the tailor's shop, stitching hems and repairing seams, but there was also quiet. There was the hush of late afternoons spent beneath the elm behind the chapel, where the children gathered in a scatter of skirts and bare feet, their laughter rising like birdsong. There was the stillness of her evenings where candlelight flickered against the walls of her small room, and the bracelet gleamed softly on its shelf, catching and holding the warmth of flame, as though it remembered too. She didn't speak much of the grave in Georgia, nor of the long road that led her there, but the journey lived in her, etched into her posture, braided into the cadence of her voice. When she spoke the children's names aloud during their lessons, she did so with reverence, as though each syllable was a kind of blessing. Names, she told them one day, are the beginning of stories, and every story matters even if no one else is listening yet. That afternoon, one of the younger girls, no more than 7, brought Sarah a loop of twine strung with 2 buttons and a bead shaped like a star. She held it out solemnly, small fingers curled around her offering. "It's for you," she said, "so you can wear it when you teach." Sarah took it gently, smiling, though her throat tightened. She slipped it around her wrist and kept it there beside the old brass bracelet that had started it all. Side by side, the 2 trinkets clinked softly as she moved, a quiet rhythm of what had been and what was becoming. The town didn't change overnight, but it changed in small ways, subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. The gruff tailor began leaving extra fabric scraps on Sarah's table without comment. A neighbor who once crossed the street to avoid her now nodded each morning. And the chapel, long quiet, found new life in the voices of children practicing their letters on its back steps. Sarah never asked permission. She simply showed up again and again until presence became permission. Sometimes after the children left and the sun dipped low, she would walk the edge of town where the train tracks hummed beneath the wind. She didn't walk to leave, but to remember, to remind herself of the road she had taken, the miles she'd carried, silence and hope in equal measure. Each step forward had once felt impossible, a risk too heavy for a woman alone. But she had walked anyway. And because of that, because she chose to face the grief instead of bury it, she could now offer something different to the girls who followed her path. Not just letters and sounds, but the quiet knowledge that they too were allowed to seek more. On one such evening, she paused beneath the gaslight near her doorway, the familiar creak of the wood steps beneath her feet. She looked up toward her window where the soft glow spilled outward and caught a glimpse of herself reflected in the glass. For a moment it startled her, not because of what she saw, but because of what she didn't. The girl who had once peered out through hollow eyes and a guarded mouth was gone. In her place stood a woman who had returned from the far edges of memory and mourning, with her spine intact and her heart somehow wider. Later that night, seated at her desk with the window open to let in the scent of dry leaves and chimney smoke, Sarah opened the small book she kept tucked behind her sewing kit. She added a single sentence to its worn pages in ink, careful and slow. Grief buried her, but love called her name and she answered. She closed the book, placed it beside the bracelet, and leaned back in her chair. Tomorrow would come as all days did. There would be buttons to sew and letters to teach and hands to guide across blank slates of paper. And in every stitch, in every word, in every child who walked home a little taller than they arrived, the echo of her mother's voice would live on, not in sorrow, but in light. The first frost came quietly dusting the rooftops of Millersville, in a silver whisper that melted by noon, but lingered in the breath of every passerby. Sarah noticed it not for the chill, but for the way it made the morning light fall differently, softer, slower, like even the sun had learned to take its time. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped outside the bracelet cool against her wrist. Its familiar weight no longer a reminder of absence, but a symbol of presence, of what had been passed down, not what had been lost. The children greeted her at the chapel steps with flushed cheeks and mittened hands, their voices already tumbling into questions and laughter. The youngest, Ruthie, named perhaps by accident for the very woman who had given Sarah her first name, slipped a folded paper into her palm. "I wrote a story," she said shyly, "about a girl who finds something important." Sarah smiled, tucked the note into her coat pocket, and gently brushed a strand of hair from Ruthie's brow. "I can't wait to read it." They gathered in a circle inside the chapel that morning, the windows fogging slightly from their breath, the wooden floor cool beneath their shoes. Sarah taught them not just to spell and sound out words, but to speak them with intention, to understand that language had power, and that power once grasped could never be taken away. Each lesson, each page turned, each hesitant pencil stroke across the lined slate was more than learning, it was reclamation. And somewhere between the sounds of children practicing vowels and the quiet scratch of graphite on paper, Sarah felt it again, that hush in her chest, that steady warmth beneath the skin. It wasn't joy exactly. It was something older, deeper, a knowing, a rootedness, like the earth itself had claimed her story and decided it mattered. That evening, after the children had gone and the sky wore its indigo coat, Sarah climbed the stairs to her room and lit the oil lamp by her window. She reached for the small notebook on her nightstand, the one she'd been filling slowly page by page, with thoughts too delicate for speaking aloud. She opened to a blank page and wrote, "I never found her hands, but I found her strength. I never heard her voice again, but I speak now with the echo she left behind." She paused, her eyes drifting to the shelf above her bed, where the bracelet rested beside the string of buttons the child had given her weeks before. She hadn't worn them that day. She hadn't needed to. The weight of legacy didn't always require touch. It could live in breath, in silence, in the act of standing still when the world tries to move you. Outside, wind stirred the dying leaves. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and was quiet. Life as always carried on. Sarah stood and crossed to the window, looking out over the town that had once been a way station and now felt inexplicably like home. It hadn't welcomed her quickly nor without silence, but she had made herself known not with noise or defiance, but with presence, steadfast day after day, until the town could no longer pretend she was invisible. And perhaps that was what healing looked like, not the erasure of pain, but the slow weaving of it into something useful. Not the forgetting of grief, but its transformation into a lantern she could hold out to others still wandering in the dark. She closed the window, turned down the lamp, and settled into bed. As she lay back, her fingers found the bracelet on the nightstand, running once more across the inscription that time hadn't managed to wear away. Sarah, little light, her name, her story, and now finally her own. If this story touched you in any way, we invite you to reflect on the light you carry and who lit it for you. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for remembering with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that honor the voices too often forgotten.